Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to this forum on the role of the National Security Advisor. I'm Ed Shuredjian, the director of the Baker Institute at Rice University. And this is really a distinct pleasure for me. This is our second major collaboration with the Woodrow Wilson Center. We put on a forum for the White House Chiefs of Staff to analyze the whole subject of the transition from campaigning to governance and the role of the White House Chief of Staff. And so this is a very natural follow-on to our collaboration with the Woodrow Wilson Center on the role of the National Security Advisor. And as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel of former national security advisors. And it's especially a pleasure for me to work with Lee Hamilton. When I was in government service, I was subjected to Lee's questionings at the House International Relations Committee, and it's wonderful to be able to work with him in this context and not have to answer his very disturbing questions. The next collaboration we're going to have with the Woodrow Wilson Center, this time it'll be at the Baker Institute at Rice University in the fall, is a forum on the Secretaries of Treasury and the role of the Secretary of Treasury and their assessment of major economic and fiscal issues. And that'll be tentatively on or about October 5th, 2001. What we're going to do today is go into our panel format and with our very distinguished moderator, who I'll introduce in a second. Our rapporteur for this session is Ivo Daalder of the Brookings Institution. He's a senior fellow at Brookings and perhaps the top expert on the National Security Council, and so we're delighted that he has taken this on. We will have questions in the second period. We'll go on from this hour till 3:30, where we'll take a short 15-minute break, and then we will go in the second session. We will take questions from the audience during that period. In the first period, our moderator will be working with the panel. Our moderator is a person who really does not need an introduction, Wolf Blitzer, the anchor of CNN's Wolf Blitzer Reports. He needs no introduction because he's not only in our living rooms, but as I told him just a while ago, he's also disturbingly in our bedrooms. He's everywhere. And we're delighted that Wolf has taken this on, his busy schedule. He's had an illustrious career, going now some 3 decades of covering historic news events around the world. He was with Reuters, the Jerusalem Post, CNN, starting in 1990. Covered the Pentagon, got a number of awards for his coverage of the Persian Gulf War with their team, and the Emmy Award for his coverage of the Oklahoma City bombings, and received the Lowell Thomas Broadcast Journalism Award, and has published 2 books. So please join me in welcoming Wolf Blitzer to the podium. Wolf.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that nice introduction. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming over this afternoon. This is an exciting time to be discussing this issue, the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. I think there's a lot of international issues right now on the agenda. You probably have some opportunity later this afternoon to get into some of those. Let me briefly introduce our panel, and then we can begin right away with the questioning. And I think that just as I didn't need much of an introduction, I don't think our panel needs much of an introduction. These are former national security advisors to different presidents, all of whom probably see the roles that they played in slightly different ways, perhaps even in considerably different ways. But we'll begin with Samuel Berger, or as I called him last night on the air, Sam Berger. I don't know why I called you Sam Berger. I never heard anybody call you Sam Berger?
Yeah, my mother used to call me.
Hi, Sam.
Zbigniew.
Sandy Berger, of course, the most recent national security advisor, serving past 4 years as the national security advisor for President Clinton. Before that, the deputy national security advisor. Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Also someone who needs no introduction, served as National Security Advisor for 4 years to President Jimmy Carter. Frank Carlucci served a more brief period of time as National Security Advisor under President Reagan, later, of course, becoming the Secretary of Defense. Andrew Goodpaster is right over there, goes further back to President Eisenhower, when that job was less, I guess, clearly defined than it subsequently became. Bud McFarlane was National Security Advisor to President Reagan, and Walt Rostow was National Security Advisor to President Johnson, all of whom went on to have distinguished careers and saw their roles, as I said, in slightly different ways. And why don't we begin with the most recent National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, and then just simply go down the panel and ask the simple question. And if you can give us a relatively brief answer, I think it would help all of us. I said that the other day when I interviewed Dr. Henry Kissinger. Before the program, I said, Dr. Kissinger, this is a limited program. It's only a half-hour program. We don't have a lot of time. So if you can keep your answers relatively short, we can get through a lot of issues. And he said to me, Mr. Blitzer, the art of diplomacy is the possible, not the impossible. And but he did very well, I must say. Sandy Berger, how did you come to see your role as the President's National Security Advisor?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Will, for congratulating me on my distinguished career since I left my job 2 months ago. I think if I had to say it in a phrase, I would say, to paraphrase the phrase from the Clinton campaign, it's the president, stupid. I mean, I think the National Security Advisor's principal role focus is in assuring that the president's well-served in his decision-making, that his decisions are executed by the government in some kind of coherent way. It is one of the only jobs I know of that is both a line job and a staff job. You're both a principal, you're both an advisor, but you're also, in a sense, the foreign policy chief of staff. You have to make sure the speech is ready. But I think the focus, I suspect for most of us, the unique focus is to in a way that the other cabinet secretaries can't, to look at how the president would be best served in his decision-making, what he needs to know in addition to what he wants to know, and how to keep the process moving in a direction that he wants it to move.
Dr. Brzezinski?
I would agree with what Sandy said, but I would add to it the following. The role of the National Security Advisor to the President is not defined by the National Security Advisor to the President. It is defined by the President. That is to say, if you have a president who comes to office intent on making foreign policy himself in a literal and even kind of on a daily basis, you have a different role than if the president comes to office, let's say, more interested in domestic affairs and more inclined to delegate authority to his principal advisors, in which case the role is also different. In the first instance, the National Security Advisor is the inevitable bureaucratic beneficiary of deep presidential involvement. In the second case, the Secretary of State, who has a constitutional responsibility, tends to be more important. And I would say that historically, since President Truman, we have had these two kinds of systems. I call one the presidential, the other one the secretarial. Some have worked well, some have worked badly, but neither system is superior to the other. Some of each have worked well, and some of each have worked badly.
Frank Carlucci?
Well, I would agree with my two colleagues. You're essentially there to serve the president. The president's styles vary from president to president. As Big says, some want to focus the foreign policy decision-making process in the White House. Others prefer to delegate it, and the National Security Advisor has to play it by ear. I think it's important to note that the National Security Advisor job, while it does have line aspects, Sandy, is essentially a staff job. A lot of Americans get the National Security Council confused with the National Security Advisor. The National Security Advisor serves the national security counsel, and he has to serve many masters as he or she does that.
General Goodpaster.
In Eisenhower's time, you have to think of this in two parts. He set up a well-structured National Security Council with a planning board of at the assistant secretary level, which really carried out the preparation that he wanted of carefully thought through plans, long-range plans, and policies. In addition, he had, in my service, not a national security advisor, but a national security assistant. And this was to differentiate, as he wished to do, between policies and long-range plans on the one hand and action decisions on the other. He quoted to us often von Moltke's dictum that at the time of decision, plans are nothing, but plans are everything. The preparatory work that went in to that preparation pays off because people understand the issues thoroughly but can adapt to the particular circumstances on which decisions are needed. I would add, just to the aphorisms that you've heard, what we came to call empirical rule number one during Eisenhower's presidency. Very simple. The president is right.
Bud McFarland.
The reference to serving the president is foremost, I think, in determining the role of the advisor. The president is a steward of our national interest, and he or she will face different circumstances and therefore different limits to what he or she can accomplish. President Reagan came to office. The body politic of our country was willing once more, with enough distance from Vietnam, to be a more activist, play a more activist role. The resources, they were more willing to support congressional enactment of larger appropriations. And the president, to his credit, was able to take that political support and fiscal support and to bring down Marxism in the Soviet Union, to end the Cold War, and to reduce nuclear weapons and so forth. It would not have been possible to do that 10 years beforehand. The advisor, in short, and the president are defined in what they can do, in part by the resources that are available, and these are not something of their own making. But what my colleagues have said about taking those resources and doing as much as you can as both a staff officer and as an advisor is what you must figure out.
Professor Rostow.
Despite the uniformity of our judgment that the president's style determines what the National Security Advisor does, these are the 5 elements that I have written down. The first is mobilizing of the information. It's not generally realized that the president steps off into the dark with almost every decision. Therefore, the mobilization of this information, big as the gap may be between what he ought to know and what he knows, is very moving, and it's the biggest job faced by the National Security Advisor. And it underlines the difference between responsibility, which is goes with decision-making, black as the future may look, and advice. Advice is cheap. The president has to live with the consequences of his decisions, whatever the information on which he must act. Secondly, the National Security Advisor ought to be able to state the point of view of each member whom the president consults with sympathy. He may disagree with it, but if it's ever looked at by a cabinet member, what is in a summary paper. Nothing is more gratifying to a national security advisor than have him say the State Department couldn't have done any better itself. Then the national security advisor is called upon to state his own opinion. He may state it temperately, but I remember the first few memos that I forwarded to President Johnson, he gently said, never send me one without your own opinion at the end. And I did, but I kept it in language temperate enough so that it was part of the team effort. Then the Secretary, the National Security Advisor has an opportunity, which is a very serious one, which is to hold a small team around the President together. This is not always possible. It may be a matter of personality that makes it difficult, but he sees and talks with the individual members around the President. He has their point of view, and he can quite often be of some use in being an intermediate between a member of the Security Council and the technical sense, and then the small team decides, the President decides, surrounded by a small team, and then comes the final act, which is to help in the execution. And let me tell you that many times in a big bureaucracy, the bureaucracy says, he doesn't mean it, and goes on doing what it's doing. And the President has to say it 3 times.
Let me at this point also encourage our panelists to, if they want to comment on each other's remarks or want to add or elaborate or disagree, whatever, please feel free to just signal that you'd like to do so. But I want to go back to Sandy Berger now, and maybe we'll go down the panel again, but once again, feel free to interrupt each other if you want. You spent 4 years as the National Security Advisor to President Clinton. A lot of major issues, of course, were on the agenda. I'm sure there were times when the Secretary of State had one strongly held position, the Secretary of Defense had another strongly held position. You probably agreed with one or the other, but you wanted to give the President all of the options honestly, fairly. Could you do that, though, if you really felt strongly, for example, the Secretary of Defense was right, the Secretary of State was wrong?
Well, I think Professor Rostow, what he said probably would be echoed by most of us. I think you have to be perceived by your colleagues as a honest representative of their viewpoint, or the system breaks down. And you would want, in any given situation, if the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State read the memo, that they would feel that their position had been stated fairly. Once you no longer, that doesn't mean that you don't express your own view, because I think that's important. In fact, I guess I would say one thing that plays off what Bud McFarland said. Not only the President is right, but you also have to, I think the National Security Advisor has to be the one often that says the President's wrong. I always felt it was my particular obligation and responsibility to give the President the downsides of a particular step he was about to take, or to simply express a contrary state to him, not as my own, but as something. There may be a consensus among his decision makers, but it may be consensus does not reflect another serious point of view.
Can you give us one specific example when you said to President Clinton, you're wrong?
Don't you know about executive privilege, Will? No, there are. I don't think I said you're wrong. I think I said I disagree many times. Some of my former colleagues are in this audience and have been there when I've done that. But I think your advice obviously is an important input. But I think to go back to your original question, I think it is, if your colleagues do not believe that you are fairly representing their point of view when they're not there, often they will be there in the decision-making process, you've failed.
Dr. Brzezinski, you were well known, and still are, of course, as a strategic thinker. As a national security advisor, you had to balance all the other positions, but you obviously came to the table with strongly held views. How did you do that? How did you accurately, fairly represent the views of various cabinet members on key international issues, while at the same time aggressively putting forward your view?
Well, I hope not aggressively, I hope persuasively. I think that one would have to be awfully stupid to misrepresent the views of your colleagues to the president, because you know that if the issue is important, there will be a discussion. The president will go back and discuss it in your presence or even the absence of your presence with his principal advisors, be they Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. And it would very quickly be evident that you distorted their views if you did. So you have to be absolutely precise and use as persuasively as you can the arguments that they have mustered in favor of their position. But it is true, as it has already been said, that the president usually wants also his national security advisor's opinion. And then you state your own, and you give the reasons for it. And if you do both, then you may have disagreement with your colleagues, but the president then has the options clearly stated. And over time, your colleagues, even if they disagree with you, learn as to how reliable is your transmission of their views. And I repeat, if the issue is important, it's likely to be discussed. And at some point, the president may pull out the paper and read from it. So you'd have to be awfully dumb to distort your colleague's point of view. But I think the presidents do want advice. And there is a relationship, a synergistic relationship between the president and the national security advisor. You wouldn't be in that job, fundamentally, if you didn't get along with the president and if you didn't see him a few times a day. So you do have a relationship. And while I do agree that the president is always right, in public, whenever there's a group, he's right because the national security advisor is helping him. In private, you have the obligation to tell him that he's wrong. And I did that repeatedly. And the president wanted me to. There was only one time that he finally sent me a little note and saying, "Zbig, don't you know when to stop?" When I went back several times trying to argue that this was not right.
Even after that note?
I think I waited a day.
You want to tell us what that issue was?
Well, yes, it involved the question of the Shah and Iran, and the question of what kind of an obligation do we have to admit him to the United States, given the previous relationship that we had.
And your position was?
That we had an obligation.
You went, Frank Carlucci, from being the National Security Advisor to becoming the Secretary of Defense. So you saw that role from within and also outside as a Secretary of Defense. Did President Reagan always say to you, "Well, Frank, what do you think?" when he got conflicting advice?
He expected me to. He didn't always say it. But let me tell you a story. When he first asked me to be National Security Advisor, I was looking for a bit of flattery, like maybe you know something about foreign policy, you've had a certain amount of experience. He didn't say that at all. He said, "Frank, I'd like you to be my National Security Advisor because you're the only person that George and Cap can agree upon." And I had to mediate any number of disputes between George and Cap. Fortunately, I had worked for both of them and knew them both quite well, but I would go through an exhaustive process to try and get them together, lunch after lunch, reducing their positions if need be to the written word. Then when I thought we had the differences defined, would present both their sides to the president. The president would ask my recommendations, and I'd give them to him, always in the knowledge that either George or Cap could appeal to the president if they so desired. And I made that absolutely clear to him, and it did happen on any number of occasions. Did I tell the president I thought he was wrong? I can remember Colin Powell, who was my deputy at the time, coming out of one meeting, and I can't remember the subject, Wolf, at this point, so don't ask me, saying, "Frank, you were pretty rough on the president." Because I certainly didn't hesitate to tell him that he was wrong, but that is done, as Spig says, in private. In public, you support the president.
But you do remember that President Reagan always used to say at the end, well, what do you think?
No, he didn't always say that. He expected me to do it. I thought I had an obligation to do it.
What about,
Can I add something to that?
yeah, go ahead.
Just the converse of that. There's one issue, but this is an example, on which I disagree with the president, but he had a view on it. So at the National Security Council, I supported his point of view, even though he knew that I disagreed with him. But I felt my obligation was to support him.
And sometimes I can say, well, sometimes it's even a little more subtle. You know the president's thinking on a particular issue before he's made a formal decision by virtue of the discussion you've had with him, and particularly if you think that this is, he's headed in the right direction, you can try to tee up a decision for him in a way that does not put him in a box. There's sort of a process by which you can try to bring the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and others to what I used to call the highest common denominator. If there was not a consensus at a fairly high level, it was better to bring the president two starkly different points of view. But some of this is a function of trying to clear the underbrush of decisions before they get to the president.
Yeah, can I add a point there?
Please, go ahead.
Towards the end of the Reagan administration, when Colin Powell became National Security Advisor, to get to your point when I was Secretary of Defense, at George Shultz's suggestion, Colin, George Shultz, and I met no substitutes every morning at 7 o'clock in Colin's office. No agenda, no substitutes, just to lay out the day's events and see if we could reach agreement. And invariably, we reached agreement, and the number of decisions that had to go to the president was greatly reduced by that process.
Mm-hmm. But General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, General Goodpaster, came at it, presidency, from his obvious military background. You had a military background as well. Was that kind of role as a staff assistant to the president the form that you adhere to?
He put great stress on looking down the road, anticipating the problems that might arise, and having preparatory work done and done very carefully, that being focused primarily in this structure of the National Security Council. To quote from him, he said, speaking of a president, he said, "He will always need the vital studies, advice, and counsel that only a capable and well-developed staff organization can give him." Now, many times things came up that had not been anticipated, and you were likely to receive the ire of Dwight D. Eisenhower if he thought they should have been anticipated. But he wanted these things thought through. He wanted them analyzed, and then he wanted to deal directly with what he called his principal lieutenants, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Director of Central Intelligence. Bring them around the table, and if a recommendation had not been worked out and agreed upon, he wanted to hear what each one said. There was not as much, I think, of conveying the thinking of his lieutenants. On occasion, he would tell us, "Now, wait a minute, boys, that's not a staff matter, that's a policy matter. I want the Secretary of State in here." And that's what happened. So we had there that the practice, the conviction on his part, that these things needed to be anticipated, they needed to be thought through, they needed to be worked through in the planning board of the National Security Council, and then he wanted to meet eyeball to eyeball with his principal associates. They would not always agree. He required that every policy study have a financial annex. Well, the financial annex meant he wanted to hear from George Humphrey. And what George Humphrey had to say was often not what other senior members of the administration had to say. But he would hear that out and resolve it and then make his own decision. He made the point, he said also, organization cannot make a genius out of a dunce. Neither can it make decisions for its head. But that was the modus operandi that he had, careful preparation and then direct discussion with his principal subordinates.
Bud McFarland, did you see yourself, when you were President Reagan's national security advisor, more as the honest broker or as a policy advisor?
You can't escape being both. I think your role as a staff person and to present fairly the views of the cabinet officers is helped by having the opportunity that Andy just described for frequent discussion with the cabinet officers and the president. I don't know, I've never tabulated it, but I imagine we had more National Security Council meetings in which Secretary of State and Defense and their colleagues could present their own point of view than, say, at Dr. Kissinger's NSC, when NSC meetings were very rarely held at all. At the end of the day, it's what the president prefers as to where the center, the locus of decision-making and discourse ought to be. I think that the time in which you may find yourself as a counselor or an advisor being more important is when you're trying to take the country in a fundamentally new direction, where you may have concerns, or the president may have concerns about a very novel idea being undermined if it is bureaucratized to the point of preemptive destruction. Mm-hmm. Here, I suppose I would cite, Henry's not here to defend himself, but the very timely reopening to China. An idea whose time really had come might well have been undermined and criticized. After all, this is a time where China was supplying weapons that were killing Americans in Vietnam. It was a time when, from a human rights point of view, China was going through a cultural revolution, killing literally hundreds of thousands of its own people. In short, a lot of reasons to criticize China from the right or the left, had that been put out for popular discussion. And so the National Security Advisor and the President conceived an idea, which I think most would say today had served the national interest well, but it was not heavily bureaucratized. Similarly, moving away from offensive deterrence and toward strategic defense and store wars. Here was an idea that President Reagan believed would have been preemptively destroyed or strangled in the crib, as Cap used to say, had it been bureaucratized and open to the criticism of a very well-informed Congress and body politic.
Professor Rostow, how visible should the National Security Advisor be to the American public?
I think it's important that he be the president's own property, as it were. But I think it does this group who's assembled and knows a great deal about these things a disservice to not to dramatize and make clear that a national security advisor can differ markedly on a major issue with the president and still function and still have his confidence. On the question of Vietnam, I happen to have taken a view different from the general view, which is that we ought to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail thoroughly on the ground and break their supply system. The president knew I held this view, and I stated the presence of the cabinet and joint chiefs on a day in the spring of 1967. The fact that I took this position and the fact that it was turned down by the President Johnson and Secretary Rusk didn't for one moment keep me from doing my job. or keep the president from knowing, that I would continue to hold my view and see him through to the end as his man, if he wanted it. That was
But once
For
your
no
view,
reason.
once you expressed that view and it was rejected by the president, didn't you yourself question your credibility with the president? Wouldn't that be normal?
Well, that's what I wanted to tell these people, that by that time he knew enough of me that I knew that he, not I, had made the decision as to the disposition of our forces. He had accepted these terms of engagement, which held our troops inside Vietnam and could not cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that he had very deep feelings in which I believe he was wrong. That on analogy with the war in Korea, the Chinese might come in, they were nuclear. The Russians might come in, they were nuclear. And he would not subject the United States to a larger war and possibly a nuclear war. That was the nature of the decision. And he and Rusk were very much affected by the entrance of the Chinese into the Korean War. And as I say, this was a decision which only a president could make. The president should know, and my colleagues should know, that I took a different view. And I did take that view. But he knew that I approved greatly of what he was doing at home and in the rest of his foreign policy. And unless he was willing, he wanted to throw me to take another job, which I was delighted to do, but I would stay with him to the end. Now, that was the element of trust. That's what I'm really dramatizing. That grew up between President Johnson and myself was very considerable. This was a major issue, and I took one view and he took another. But that didn't affect really my ability to do my job, and I was quite ready, of course, to resign.
General Goodpester.
I might add an instance during Eisenhower's time as president. One day he called me in by punching the buzzer on my desk, and I always knew that was not good news in prospect when that happened. And he said, "We're not doing anything about reducing our forces in Europe, and that's our policy." And he felt committed to try to do that, going all the way back to his time when he took the command there and persuaded our Congress and our government to send 4 additional U.S. divisions there. He always felt that those should be reduced as soon as possible, and he said that that was our policy. I said, "Well, Mr. President, it's not quite complete, because that in your policy paper, NSC paper, it says that that's to be done when the Europeans are prepared to assume that additional responsibility for their defense." No, he said, "our policy is very clear, it's the reduction." I said, "Well, sir, there is that qualification." He said, "Foster Dulles is coming over today, and I'm going to have him straighten you out on this." And I went in with Secretary Dulles. I hadn't said a word to him in advance. The President had this on his mind. He went through this litany, and Foster Dulles, bless his heart, pursed his lips, as he always did, blinked his eyes, looked up to the ceiling, and said, "Well, Mr. President, it's not quite as simple as that. We do have this qualification." He looked at the secretary and he said, "Foster, I've lost my last friend." But that's the way we would try to talk through the issue and, in a way, make sure that, as Eisenhower himself was wont to say, we didn't make any mistakes in a hurry.
As far as the organization of the National Security Council, Sandy Berger, why don't we begin with you? some have said it's like sort of a mini State Department. Others have said it's a sort of mini Defense Department. A lot of duplication among staffers at the NSC, what others are doing at the State Department or other agencies of the U.S. government. Was that a problem, the overlap, or was it something that you could easily deal with?
No, I don't think it's overlap. I think that one of the important functions of the National Security Council staff is to coordinate decision-making, particularly at the working level, between the various agencies. And I suspect, as you look over the historical period here, the number of those agencies has grown. The Treasury Department is now more often involved if there's a financial crisis in Asia. The Justice Department may be more often involved if it's a terrorism and law enforcement issue. And the best senior director at the National Security Council is able to bring people around a table and run an interagency process in a way that often the State Department or Defense Department could not do.
For example, the senior official at the NSC on the Middle East, let's say, there would be senior officials on the Middle East of the State Department who were doing almost exactly the same thing that your advisor on the Middle East was doing at the NSC.
No, I don't think so. I mean, every issue is different. Let's take the Middle East. The Middle East, obviously, the senior working level diplomat was Dennis Ross. He, just as in Russia, it was Strobe Talbot at the State Department. Dennis was a principal negotiator below the secretary, but someone had to do the briefing memo for the president when King Hussein was coming, when he was going into a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu or Prime Minister Rabin or Prime Minister Barak. So I think there was a complementarity and a team that worked very well together. The Middle East actually is a very good example. Ed Dirigian is quite familiar with it, where there has been a kind of a very, I think, good blending of tasks between the State Department and the NSC and often the Defense Department. So it depends very much on the area and the personalities. I mean, that is, there'll be a particular area where clearly the dominant working level personality is at the State Department or at the Defense Department, and will naturally, the decision-making will cluster around that person. But generally, I don't see what the NSC does as duplicative. I see it as trying to have a coherent decision-making process.
Dr. Brzezinski, was it your experience that there would be rivalries, jealousies between officials at the NSC and the State Department who were fundamentally working in the same areas?
Never.
I was at the State Department at a lower level when Dr. Brzezinski was in National Security Council.
Let me say this. First of all, everyone thinks
Very subtle question.
that when they were in charge, the system was just great. I mean, let's take that as a given, okay? It's also a fact that the NSC system has changed over the years. It started with a very small cluster of people. It grew over time a great deal. Where I might perhaps differ from Sandy is in defining where NSC coordination should take place. It may be simply a question of terminology, but it may be a little more substantive than that. Sandy said that the NSC provides coordination at the working level. I would put it differently, and I think it has implications for the size of the staff and what it does. I would say coordination has to take place at the presidential level. That is to say, when the decisions are of a presidential level type decisions, then NSC coordination is necessary. I don't think it should be at the working level, because at the working level there are a great many decisions which are really not of presidential type. And if you try to make decisions more or less at the desk officer level, you will end up with a staff on the NSC, which in my view is too large. It becomes a mini foreign ministry, and it shouldn't be. Now, I don't know what the happy medium is. I would suspect it's probably somewhere around, 50, 60 or so, given the role the United States plays in the world today. But I would say, in general, the staff should coordinate only those decisions which really have what might be called a presidential level character to them.
Frank,
I don't entirely agree with that.
how big was your staff when you were there?
Well, in terms of policy people, it was similar, 60, 70 policy people. There are a lot of administrative people and people who run the Situation Room and do other tasks. But I think we're talking here about people who are policymakers. I would take an example. During the run-up to the period involving Bosnia, our engagement in Bosnia, there were day-to-day decisions that needed to be made that were not at the presidential level, but were critically important, that are generally made at the assistant secretary level or above, sometimes at the deputy level. And the deputies committee is an extremely important, or has become extremely important, part of the engine of decision-making. I think in those issues that are high priority and fast-moving, it is often useful, although I think you can't generalize, for the NSC to be convening the Defense Department, the State Department, and others, because the institutional tensions between state and defense often are such that without a third party in the chair, things fall back on bureaucratic instinct.
Picking up on that point, well, go ahead, General. Good, Pastor, go ahead.
Oh, I'd like to add just a bit to that. I worked with President Nixon, President-elect Nixon, while he was organizing his administration for the conduct of foreign policy and security policy. It is a very intense and acute disagreement arose involving those of us who had seen the operation in the Eisenhower time, had seen it especially in the time of President Johnson, as to who should chair the subordinate groups, the ad hoc groups that are pulled together to deal with some regional set of issues, some functional issue, and the like. And on the one side were those, myself included, who felt that it was absolutely necessary to have those groups chaired by someone at the Security Council level. Otherwise, the issue would be vulnerable to bureaucratic drift pushed by one or the other of the departments, which simply was not ready to have the matter decided. After this argument was thoroughly voiced, President Nixon came down on the side of having the groups chaired in that way. There are those of us who think that when Henry Kissinger took the post, that was perhaps pushed a little more than had been intended to have the energy, the drive come from the White House. But for what President Nixon had in mind, which is that he himself was going to be very active, directly engaged in the great questions of foreign policy and security policy, a procedure that put the White House representatives in the chair, and they had to be informed representatives who could hold their own in the debates in those groups. That seemed to be absolutely essential.
Is that Frank Carlucci, always inevitable that there will be a rivalry between the Secretary of State, let's say, and the National Security Advisor to the President?
No, I don't think it's inevitable.
No.
I think there's a healthy tension between the Department of Defense and the Department of State, which in many instances the National Security Advisor has to mediate. There was some tension when I came in. You may recall I came in the wake of Iran-Contra, and George Shultz held a dim view of the National Security Council at that point, and he did not want me to chair meetings. He's got this in his book. I said, fine, and I borrowed a leaf from Spig's book, because I remembered when Spig was National Security Advisor, you had deputy secretaries meeting, and I said, fine, we'll have a deputy secretaries group, and it'll be chaired by Colin Powell. And that worked very, very nicely. Then when the president chaired the meetings, I briefed the president, I kicked off the meetings, the president would say a few words, and then I'd frame the issues for the group. So and George in his book ends up saying, well, it worked out okay. So you can find a way to do this, but at least initially in an administration, who chairs the meetings always tends to be a difficult issue.
Bud McFarland, when you were the National Security Advisor, there was a lot of he raised the issue of the Iran-Contra. There was obviously a very active National Security Council team that was involved in Central America, sometimes without the knowledge of the State Department or even the Defense Department. I don't know if that was an aberration or if that's what had developed over the years leading up to you.
Well, it's a very good point. The National Security Council can and must restrict its role to staff or advisory and not to operations. There's one point of disagreement. There was never anything done that the Secretary of State and Defense were not fully informed about, and that's a matter of public record now. But it's true that what can happen and what the security advisor must guard against is the frustration a president can experience as someone who is there for 4 years to get something done, to be able to demonstrate leadership in X or Y area, and the frustration at not seeing that the Department of State or others in his administration are apparently moving in that direction. But that cannot lead the Security Council or the advisor to go beyond the line and take on an operational role. You simply don't have the resources and you don't have the mandate in law to do that. So that's a big mistake.
Is that, Professor Rosta, a mistake for the NSC to get involved operationally in implementing various policy decisions the president might make?
Before responding to your question, I should introduce from outside this room some testimony which arrived to me as emailer. This is my wife's diagram out of a book that she's using to teach American foreign policy. And what you're listening to is one of the eternal fights of this group. This group very largely taking the sociological point of view. This from George Marshall's move to the State Department to Henry Kissinger's movement back from the White House, on all these moves up to the present day when Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld and the Vice President have moved, are among a group who've wrestled with this problem over the years. And Elspeth wanted this group to be reminded of it. That's why I got this email this morning. But the point about it is that this is a problem which can be solved, as Frank says, between the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State. And my own view is, my own experience with Secretary Rusk over the years has been that with the right characters in place and a mutual deference and mutual trust, it can be solved, but it's not always solved. I mean, the relations between state and defense were one thing when Mr. Truman's friend from Missouri was in Department of Defense, quite different when his successor, who was, what was his name again? The moved over to defense, who was close to Atchison, and that a lot does depend upon the relations between these two parties. The truth is
We're thinking of Louis Johnson and Dean
Johnson
Acheson.
and
Dean Acheson.
Yeah, Atchison. No, then there was in the Secretary of Defense there was another man involved who was Atson's
Clark Clifford.
contemporary at Yale.
Clark Clifford?
What?
Clark Clifford?
Well, it doesn't matter. The question of personality does matter. As for the issue involved, my own preference has been to have the state take the role of coordinator as far as possible, and leave the National Security Council to concentrate on the issues which the president ought to concern himself with. The truth about General Eisenhower was that he found the endless meetings of the NSC a great burden to him, when he couldn't get out of them exactly what he hoped to get out of them. And as he himself once said to his national security advisor, that he was getting at these meetings what he could get from the New York Times if he read it carefully. It's very easy to overload the president, and it's very. He should be able to find the time, like any executive of a big organization, to concentrate on a major issue and not be diverted. And a lot of those issues should be settled beneath him. And the Eisenhower administration had a very successful committee of undersecretaries. Really saved the president a great deal of work, and it was congenial. And we had trouble convincing the successors to the Eisenhower administration that at the undersecretary level, this committee worked well, and the committees that worked well also were headed by strong assistant secretaries, the so-called ERGs, worked well. And we did something at that time which I'm very proud of, and I had a hand in, which was to reduce the size of the NSC. As you all know from your own experience, the good Lord only produces a certain number of first-rate people. And it's much better to have a small first-rate staff than to lard it up with a big bureaucracy. And I know when that took place. It took place after the Kennedy-Johnson period, but it's wonderfully clarifying if a man has a responsibility for a certain field and the only person working for him is a secretary. And everyone who works for somebody else takes some of his time, takes some of his energy. And we could have an interdepartmental meeting at the NSC level, staff level, very easily by calling 3 or 4 people into the room who knew all about the cables, which came from Europe and the UN and from Africa and so on, whatever the issue might be. So I would opt for a small staff, and I would opt for a concentration of effort in the White House on the major issues, and I would opt for putting a great deal of responsibility on the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries to take the issues off the neck of the president.
Sandy Berger, correct me if I'm wrong, but there were times when the president would want to send you on a diplomatic mission overseas, as opposed to someone from the State Department or the Defense Department or someplace else. Was there a time or two when you did that?
Very rarely. I mean, I think it is an unusual circumstance when the National Security Advisor should be the principal negotiator or diplomat.
What were the occasions when you went someplace at the request of the president as opposed to an assistant secretary of state or the secretary of state or somebody else?
You know, I went to Moscow before a summit between President Clinton and President Yeltsin, at which NMD and the ABM treaty were to be discussed to try to see whether we could get some closure before the meeting. And because of the configuration of authority in the Kremlin, it was appropriate in that circumstance for me to go. But I think generally the chief diplomat, the chief negotiator, should be the Secretary of State. I know that's not always been the case, and there have been some extraordinary initiatives that have been executed by the National Security Advisor. We talked about Kissinger and China, and some of the work that Zbig did in China. But I think generally it is better to let have the Secretary of State in that role. Otherwise, he or she is often undermined in terms of their credibility that they bring to the important work that they're doing every day.
Isn't that a fact, Dr. Brzezinski, that especially with foreign leaders who know there's a very active, smart national security advisor, they'd rather deal, and perhaps there's a weaker Secretary of State, they'd rather deal directly with that national security advisor than the Secretary of State?
Well, sure, but if there's a passive and stupid national security advisor, they'd rather deal with the Secretary of State. I think it really depends on the circumstances. In my case, I recall 4 trips in which I had to play a role, and I think there were reasons in each case. One was China. Sandy alluded to that. The Secretary's trip to China didn't work out quite the way the President had hoped. So I was sent to China, and that led to some consequences.
But didn't that undermine the Secretary of State, though, once you were sent?
It probably did, but it furthered the American-Chinese relationship and furthered what the President wanted, and that's a trade-off. Another occasion was the Middle East. And the President wanted me to go to talk to Sadat about an issue that I don't think the Secretary of State could have really talked about, and it's the relationship between the prospects for progress and our domestic political scene and the President's own situation.
Wolf, there is a
The third one was INF, when the Soviets posed a challenge in Europe. The Europeans were very alarmed. We had to deploy cruise missiles and Pershings, and we had to negotiate that with the Europeans, rapid deployment of missiles. And the last one was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the need to organize some sort of response in the region, backed by the United States.
And in all 4 of those cases, the President thought you were the best qualified person as opposed to the Secretary of State or somebody else.
Yes, and in these cases, I agreed with the President.
Bud McFarland, you want
At
to...
least these guys.
Well, to put it in its more defensible light, it can be driven, the decision as to who goes, by what is the perception of the foreign government about the authenticity, the president's commitment to a given decision. That is, especially for authoritarian governments, the Soviet Union, for China, because they don't put much credence in their own bureaucracy. They assume that they shouldn't attach much to that of the United States, and so they attach more legitimacy to something that comes from the White House directly. But George Shultz had a very, I think, sensible understanding of that, and specifically because he wanted it always to be clear that he was speaking for the President, he would usually take me on a trip. And I was in a subordinate role, and I saw it that way, but I saw that I was there as kind of a prop to make it very clear to the Soviet Union or to China that that Secretary of State was speaking clearly for the President here.
The
Go ahead, General.
President from time to time will choose a special representative to go and engage in a more intimate and a form of dialogue which is recognized as quite authentic in terms of the interests of our country. Normally, in my observation, these have been people that have been even nominated to the president, suggested to the president, but it's people in whom the president has special confidence. And that's known at the receiving end and can be very useful.
I think there's one other dimension here, and that is that the Secretary of State, when she or he travels, cuts a broader public swath than perhaps the National Security Advisor. They travel with the press corps from the State Department. They're there in a official capacity. There's certain protocol and ceremonial circumstances that surround it. And there are times when you want to engage at the highest levels less obtrusively. And the National Security Advisor can get on a plane with one or two people and fly into Beijing and meet with the leadership and fly out, maybe drawing some attention from the local media, but not a lot from the national media here. And that sometimes is useful for trying to make progress on a particularly delicate issue.
Did you want to say something about it?
Well, if you'll indulge a moment of humor that's related to this, in December of '84, President Reagan was promoting a concept, the Star Wars concept, as kind of the centerpiece of a larger policy for engaging the Soviet Union. And Prime Minister Thatcher was being critical, and persuasively critical. And it was undermining the president's case here in the Congress and elsewhere. And she came to Camp David in December of '84, and in the privacy of that setting said, now look here, Ron, this is expensive, it's technologically risky, it is presenting the appearance that you are trying to achieve a first strike capability, it's going to decouple us from Europe. A very, very penetrating analysis, which had some merit to it, and the president was chagrined. We papered over it in the press conference, but afterward he said, Bud, would you go to London, please, and try to talk to the Prime Minister and at least ask her to be a little bit more subdued. And so I went to London the following month, and about 2 paragraphs into the talking points, I could see I was getting nowhere. And before going, Cap Weinberger, to his credit, had said, Bud, you know, there's going to be a need to subcontract a lot of this work, and the UK ought to get some of that. And so I could see I was getting nowhere, and the Prime Minister paused for a moment, and I said, Prime Minister, the President believes that up to $300 million on occasions ought to be subcontracted to British firms here. Long pause. And a couple of weeks later, I'm forgotten the circumstance, but the President and she met again, and she took me aside and she said, you know, there may be something to this after all.
Professor Rostow, years ago I wrote a book on U.S.-Israeli relations, and I remember the chapter on the Six-Day War in 1967. You were intimately involved. Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State, and President Johnson had to make some major decisions, obviously, during that war. And I remember a lot of the Israelis I interviewed during my research saying that they would often find it a lot better from their standpoint to go to the NSC, meaning you and your aides, who they felt had a direct pipeline to President Johnson, than to work through the State Department and Dean Rusk, where they found that there was a lot of resistance to what they wanted. Do you remember those days? I'm sure you'd probably do.
I don't remember them in those terms. The president had very strong views, and he was on top of that from morning till night, quite literally. And there nothing engaging more personally, I should think, than the Arab-Israeli War, because it had rather ominous Soviet connections, especially with Syria. And so the view of the diplomats from Israel about the relative advantage of working through state or through the White House refer really to the extent to which the President of the United States was desk officer for that war. And very quickly he got a decision from him, which was a personal decision.
Frank Carlucci, did you find that that was the case when you were at the NSC as well?
I don't think there's any doubt that people want to get as close to the president's office as they can. When Hans-Dietrich Genscher was foreign minister of Germany, he was always in our office. He was in Howard Baker's office. He was in my office. He insisted on seeing Ronald Reagan every time he came into town. He was all over the place. You know, the standard joke, they had an airplane crash over the Atlantic and Genscher met Genscher because he traveled so much. No, I think, and it's very hard for a national security advisor to say, no, I'm not going to receive the prime minister of whatever it might be. So you have to just keep tapping it down and handle it skillfully and keep, above all, keep the Secretary of State informed.
Dr. Brzezinski, when you were the NSC advisor, a lot of us remember, who covered you, some of the tensions that existed with the Secretary of State. Were those overblown or were those real?
Well, quite honestly, they were overblown, and I'm serious. That is to say, on many issues we agreed. We disagreed basically just on one issue, fundamentally, and that was how to handle the Soviet Union, how to combine detente and cooperation with competition and potential conflict. But on the Middle East, we agreed. We agreed on China. We agreed on a lot of issues. But once the press determines there's a conflict between two principles, you can't do anything about it. I'll give you an account which pertains to one of your colleagues. There was a day when the Secretary of State and I were supposed to make speeches in the same place on the same subject, that is to say, U.S.-Chinese relations. And Vance and I sat down and decided how to do it, and we had two speeches drafted. His assistant, Holbrook, my assistant, Oxenberg, worked together drafting the two speeches. Then we reread them to make sure they're consistent. And then at the last minute, I forget whether it was May or Vance, one of us said to the other, actually, it would be better if you gave this speech and I gave that speech, because one stresses more the domestic security aspect, the other one a little more foreign policy. So I'll take the speech and you give that speech. So we both gave those speeches, changing who read which manuscript first. And next day, the New York Times diplomatic correspondent, has a front page story. It says, Vance and Brzezinski disagree again on China. And once that mindset is created in the press, nothing can stop it. And I'm sure right now Rumsfeld and Powell are pretty much condemned to that scenario.
There's also, Wolf, I think, an institutional dynamic that that maximizes the potential for conflict, because there's really two layers of spin before you get a conflict here. First, you've got something reported in the press. In the morning, you read that the Secretary of State reads that officials at the White House said, da-da-da-da-da, which maybe is disparaging of the State Department's point of view, or vice versa. So that's layer number one. That gets delivered to the Secretary or to the National Security Advisor by his or her press person, who tends to see their role rather protectively in terms of their principle. That's layer number two. And by the time you've got this story to the National Security Advisor and the Secretary, it sounds like thermonuclear war. And one of the rules that Secretary Albright and I worked out under these circumstances was never to believe anything that we read about each other in the newspaper or that are said to about each other by people who work for us without picking up the phone and talking to each other. And we diffused more incipient conflicts by doing that than I can tell you.
Is it wise, General Goodpaster, for the National Security Advisor from time to time to be, in effect, the principal foreign policy spokesperson for the President?
Well, times have changed so drastically since Eisenhower's time that I don't know that his example would have much relevance today. And he himself recognized there will be differences personal differences among in the characters of the successive presidents, but his conviction was that the Secretary of State should have a major role as the spokesperson for foreign policy. He stayed in very close touch with Eisenhower directly on this, but that system worked out very well. And whereas Jim Haggerty, who was Eisenhower's press secretary, played a very major role, he really stayed out of foreign policy and security policy to a large extent. So when you heard these issues discussed, they would be discussed in an authoritative way by the Secretary of State or by Eisenhower himself, who felt that he had an obligation on the major issues to take a public stance. I don't think that can be done today, but to the extent as much as possible can be pushed out of the White House, I think that the executive branch performance will benefit from that.
Frank, I'll let you want to.
Yeah, in my judgment, the National Security Advisor should not be out front, but should be part of a coordinated public relations strategy. I thought the administration last Sunday worked it very well, where you had Colin Powell on there as a principal spokesman, you had Dick Cheney commenting, and you had Condi Rice on, I think, your show.
That's right.
And they all were saying the same thing.
But
And I think that's reassuring.
invisible was Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense.
Well, that's
Part of the
appropriate.
strategy.
That is part of the strategy.
What was
I
the
think it
strategy?
The strategy was to make sure this was handled in diplomatic channels, not military channels. And that message came through loud and clear. I thought it was very well handled.
I agree with Frank on that. I think that it is important for the Secretary of State to be the definitive and principal spokesperson for below the president. But one of the things, if you look at the trajectory of time represented on this panel, the media playing field has gotten much larger, and you need a lot of players on the field very often. There was no CNN when most of these gentlemen served as National Security Advisor, and the world was, of course, much worse for it, Wolf. But both the pace of media scrutiny, the pace of the news cycle is now almost continuous, and the breadth of the media, I think, tends to pull the National Security Advisor out more as part of a team of people who goes out. But I think always with the Secretary of State at the lead.
That's a point, Dr. Brzezinski, that's well made, because there's such an appetite out there now on television. There's all the cable channels and 5 Sunday morning shows that the White House somehow has to service. You can't just expect the Secretary of State to appear on 5 shows if there's a major foreign policy issue that week.
Well, that's already been said, and I completely agree with that. I would merely add the following. Precisely because of these pressures, these competitive pressures, the skills, the communicative skills of a Secretary of State have become very different. Let's say in the 50s, the Secretary of State primarily made speeches, formal speeches, or he would write a ghostwritten article for the Foreign Affairs magazine, and it would be kind of authoritative. Now you not only are pulled in many different directions, but you have to be quick on the uptake. You have to be, to some extent, photogenic. You have to be able to communicate in, what are they called, those?
Sound bites.
Sound bites. These are skills
Something I'm familiar with.
which a Secretary of State has to have. And some of them in recent years have had them, currently have them as well. Some in recent years didn't have them quite to the same degree. So a president and his people have to sort of say, well, who else on the team can help here? And I think the present administration is doing very well, and I think the previous one did too, in kind of covering the front and more or less blanketing the programs on Sunday, for example, with leading spokesmen.
I would just add,
General, you didn't have to worry about CNN in your day.
that's right. When I came into the White House as a staff officer and asked for advice on what I should do. It was very brief. It said, do your job the best you know how and stay out of the newspapers. And that was very welcome advice. Well, the appetite is voracious today, and it will not be denied. And all of this has to be reconstructed to conform to that, in my opinion.
Bud McFarland, that was a factor when you were the NSC advisor, but certainly not the way it is right now.
Well, I guess I'd make a different point, and that is, in my judgment, the Vietnam War is kind of one of the many lessons learned ought to be that no administration can carry its policy if it can't define for the American people what are our interests and how are they engaged and what is our strategy for winning it. And I think that it was largely the inability to do that. Now, it does go to your point in the question in the sense that, as Frank said, the Secretary of State has to be the person who is the spokesperson, but that is buttressed by a strategy that uses the resources you have, because it is in our Constitution an obligation to explain what it is you're trying to do, and it takes a lot of resources to do that, as Sandy said.
Let me go around the panel because we're getting close to taking a break, but I'm just curious. The National Security Advisor to the President does not have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate, as opposed to all the members of the Cabinet, senior officials in the executive branch. Is that useful nowadays? The downside, of course, is that the National Security Advisor almost usually is not a member of the Cabinet.
That's a blessing. Judging from the cabinet meetings that I've attended, I'm sorry to be so flat in my statement, but that's the truth. If you sit and look at the cabinet closely and see the number of people along the wall, first, there are very few issues on which all the members of the cabinet should be present. They're simply not their business to worry about national security items, just as issues that are very important to the Secretary of Transport should not engage the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. Besides the cabinet meetings leak, any meeting in Washington with that many people present will leak. And that is the reason why a great deal of the business with the President is discussed with 2 or 3 cabinet members present.
President Kennedy used to have a lot of formal cabinet meetings.
Did what?
President Kennedy.
Well, I don't know. I don't recall it because I was not directly responsible. I was directly responsible for the national security meetings, and I finally worked out the sort of national security issue which could usefully engage the whole cabinet. And they were not issues generally in which the president would make a decision. They were to get where domestic and foreign policy considerations had to be woven with financial considerations. It was a chance to get the issue formulated and then special studies allocated to different departments. This was a very specific procedure that was worked out, and one of the meetings I remember very well was one in which a decision was made that we'd better open up quickly some new areas for grain production. The world situation demanded that. There were also very useful meetings which involved a great many people before the meetings of the UN, which were occasions for a lot of bilateral. There were also occasions in which the ambassador came home to say country X was having a visit to Washington, and the prime minister was interested in getting A, B, and C accomplished from his point of view. Good, said the president. Now let me tell you what I'm interested in. Now go away and produce a paper on that. There were a set of meetings which were worthy of bringing together the whole cabinet and bringing together a president's instruction for the next operational decision.
Comment on this for a second?
Yeah, but go ahead, because you're satisfied with the way the structure is done.
I want to make a distinction, which I don't think was made here, which needs to be made. One should not confuse cabinet status with Senate confirmation. They're not the same thing.
Right.
Now, in my case, I didn't have Senate confirmation, but I had cabinet status. But it was totally irrelevant. I had to attend the cabinet meetings, and I think the only difference between me with cabinet status as a national security advisor and my colleagues who weren't is that I sat at the table instead of sitting against the wall. But most cabinet meetings are routine, non-significant events, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Now,
I think there's
confirmation is a different issue. Now, the National Security Advisor could be confirmed, and there have been ideas to that effect, just as the head of the Bureau of the Budget is confirmed. I personally preferred that it not be so, because if you get confirmed, you also have to testify a lot, you have to go down to the Hill a lot. The schedule demands on you are so enormous already that would be an additional burden and would greatly complicate the issue we talked about earlier, namely, who speaks for foreign policy in the government besides the president? And it should be the Secretary of State. And if you were confirmed, that would become fussed and confused.
You were a member of the cabinet, but Sandy Berger, you were not a member of the cabinet.
Well, I don't know. I sat at the table. I don't know if I was a member of the cabinet or not.
Well, you were a semi-member.
No one ever told me whether I was or not. But I guess took the chair there. But I think the point that Zbig just made is a key point here. With confirmation comes a almost legal obligation of accountability to the Congress. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense spend enormous amounts of time on the Hill. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense may have to testify 6 or 8 times on the budget of their agency. And each of those testimonies, of course, is an occasion to answer the question of every member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which may or may not be related to the budget. I actually think that this has become too burdensome on the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. But perhaps a third of their time is engaged in this. And so the one benefit of not having confirmation is that you can say no to a congressional committee. In fact, most presidents have taken the view that under executive privilege that their national security advisor, just like their chief of staff, can't be compelled to go up on the Hill.
I'd like to reinforce that, going back particularly to the Eisenhower time, when he really established in modern years the idea of executive privilege and the idea of confidential advice that the president is entitled to receive that need not be reported in any other place. Now, so long as it's advice, that works, and there is no confirmation. There's a risk. Any moving over into the area of operations, then under the Constitution, there is an obligation to report, and a necessity, I think, would come from that for confirmation. So if that line between advice and operations can be held, it can be greatly to the advantage of the needs of the president.
Let's take Buck and Frank Carlucci, then we're going to take a break. But correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. McFarland, you were a member of the cabinet, right?
It's a little bit like what Sandy said. Yeah, I was at the table. I've got a chair in my office now and so forth. But and the cabinet secretary said I was. But I think I agree with what my colleagues have said here. And yet I believe that there has got to be a congressional relations strategy from the White House, as there is a public affairs strategy. And while it relies on your liaison people that are chosen for that job, we take Star Wars. This was something on which the Congress, Lee Hamilton would remember this, had quite a number of legitimate critics and well-informed people. Sam Nunn, now Les Aspin, thoughtful, analytical minds. And so I was spending certainly a fourth of my time in meetings with congressional leaders and simply explaining what the president intended here. And I think that is something that has to continue. And it never got to the point where they tried to subpoena, or because it wasn't necessary. You have to have a working dialogue with members of Congress.
Frank Carlucci, we're going to take a break right after,
Yeah.
your final, you're going to
Well,
have the
the
last
point
word in
that-
this segment, but you spent a lot more time meeting with members of Congress when you were defense secretary than when you were the national security
I was up
advisor.
there forever. And there are days weeks when you testify practically every day, morning and afternoon. So I think, I feel even more strongly than my colleagues, if you make the National Security Advisor subject to Senate confirmation, you're going to degrade the process significantly. The president will have a very difficult time implementing a coherent foreign policy. I think the president would simply name another staff person to do what the National Security Advisor does and let this confirmed official run around on the Hill. I think it would impede the ability to give confidential advice to the president, so I would strongly recommend against it.
All right, we're going to take about a 10-minute break right now. I'm going to say goodbye because I have to get ready for my excellent program tonight at 8 o'clock. I hope all of you will be watching. But Ed and Lee Hamilton are going to be taking over. I want to thank all of you for coming. But don't leave. We have a lot more to talk about, including your questions for this panel when we come back.
That's the best reason.